Thanks. First, let me thank the NSCA and the conference committee for allowing me to come here and speak today. And we need to go through this conflict of interest thing. I don't have any conflict of interest. I don't own anything. Meg doesn't own anything. The bank owns us. And I'm not here to sell you anything. Now, the discussion that we're going to have deals with broadly physiological aspects that affect strength and power. But we only have 50 minutes, so we're going to talk about one small aspect of that, and that deals with rate of force development. So, to begin to understand this, we need to understand force transmission through tissues. And basically, the force transmission is going to affect your ability to produce force and rate of force development. Now, we see here basically the pathway. And force production begins at the level of the sarcomere. It travels on down through the tissues. It reaches the level of the costomere, and that helps transmit forces laterally and so on. Eventually, we get down to the tendon and its transfer of forces to the bone. Now, the way we're defining rate of force development is essentially it is explosive strength. It is not velocity. It is not power, but it's strongly related to both of those, and it influences both of those. And if you haven't seen it yet, there's an excellent, excellent review of the literature here that deals with this. Now, in terms of why is rate of force development important? If you think about it, every sport has some critical time period. For example, a critical time period in sprinting would be the amount of time that the foot is in contact with the ground. And the more force we can generate in that period of time, the more likely you are to produce a superior performance. So if we take a look at this slide here, notice that this particular person or group of people produce a relatively high rate of force development. And so if the critical time period, like foot contact time for a really good sprinter, is going to be around 90 milliseconds or less. And so they would have an advantage there. Now, there's a couple of things that we're going to deal with in this discussion. We're going to talk some about, and again, this is a Reader's Digest version, but we're going to talk some about the various mechanisms that deal with rate of force development, and a little bit about the measurement. Now, remember, rate of force development is essentially the change in force per change in time. Now, in terms of force transmission and therefore rate of force development, most of the time when we measure this, when scientists measure this, they measure it isometrically. Often it is in single joints. And the reason that's done is because you then control for changes in joint angle, and you also control for velocity changes. In other words, they're static. And so we can get pretty well controlled rates of force development. However, in terms of particularly sport and even some daily activities, they take place with multi-joint activities. And in recent years, we've begun to measure not only the magnitude of force, but rate of force development isometrically and dynamically, and also using multi-joint activities. So remember that depending upon a number of factors like positional specificity, for example, isometric parameters can have good correlations with dynamic measurements, not only of maximum strength, but dynamic measures of or dynamic performances in terms of sport. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. Using the athletes at East Tennessee State, for example, weightlifters and throwers, over a period of over 10 years now, using primarily isometric pulls and sometimes isometric squats, we have found very strong correlations between these measurements and vertical jumps, snatch, cleans, squats, and so on. For example, this is from a study by Mizuguchi and Gray with our soccer team, and here you see jumping movements, counter movement jumps, and notice we've got unweighted and weighted counter movement jumps, and we get height, peak force, peak velocity, peak power, the impulse, and so on. And notice there are very good correlations with the isometric variable of rate of force development and these dynamic measures here. So we can get very good relationships between isometric and dynamic activities, provided you take into consider positional characteristics and positional specificity. Now, rate of force development is often, in various studies, better related to performance than the magnitude of strength. That is peak strength or peak force. That's not to say that peak force is not important and not related, but many times we get better relationships with the rate of force development. Indeed, the rate of force development is quite sensitive to both acute and chronic changes in neuromuscular function. And so rate of force development is quite sensitive to the state of training that the athlete is in, including states of fatigue. We also know that resistance training, strength training, can cause gains in maximum strength, and typically we get increases in maximum strength and rate of force development simultaneously. Although there is overlap in the mechanisms, they are not exactly the same. Now, we know, as we just said, that rate of force development is strongly related to maximum strength, and we'll talk about that more later. And so stronger athletes are typically going to show higher peak and average rates of force development. There are three primary mechanisms that we're going to discuss here today: the nervous system, the muscle itself, and a little bit about tissue stiffness. So we'll first talk about the nervous system, maybe. Now, in terms of the determinants of force transmission and rate of force development, the nervous system is extremely important because obviously it activates motor units and muscle. And the magnitude of force production is correlated with the magnitude of the muscle activation and therefore motor unit activation, both related to the number of motor units activated and also the discharge rate, that is, rate coding. Also, recruitment order appears to be pretty consistent. Whether it's fast or slow contractions, the size principle seems to hold. However, the relative contribution of rate coding versus recruitment can change. In isometric and slower velocity movements, there is a steady recruitment of motor units to an upper limit of about 80 to 90% of your peak force, and then rate coding tends to take over. All muscles are not exactly the same, but that's a generality. In faster movements, where the velocity is higher, and including ballistic movements, we still have, the size principle still holds. But it's interesting that as you increase the velocity and the rate of force development, the threshold for activation is lowered both in type 1 and especially type 2 fibers. And so they become active sooner. Now, that reduction in recruitment threshold with increased velocity and rate of force development is fiber specific. And as I said before, it tends to be a little bit greater in type 2 fibers. And so in a muscle like the soleus, where it's primarily type 1 fibers, if you're able to recruit the type 2 fibers that are there sooner, you're going to get bigger increases in force and impulse as a result of that. In sustained high forces like isometric contractions or very slow movements, the maximum rate coding hits at tops about 60 hertz. But in faster movements, high velocity movements, particularly ballistic movements, it may reach as high as 120 hertz. And what's really interesting, one of the things that we mentioned before is with strength training, you get increases in the ability to produce higher rates of force development as a result of that strength. And among well-trained strength and power athletes, we may find rates of force development, or rather rate coding as high as 200 hertz. And that, again, occurs in strength power trained subjects, not typically in untrained subjects or lesser trained subjects. Now, in terms of this relationship, we can see it schematically here. And this was from a paper by Comey some years ago, back in the 1980s. And we can see two different curves here. And notice, we'll start with curve B. We have a relatively slow rate of activation of the muscle. And we can see that reflected in the isometric force time curve. In other words, it ramps up until we hit peak. Here we have a much faster activation of the muscle, and notice that is reflected in the force time curve. And so we see a nearly vertical line here representing rate of force development. Now, there is a large individual variation in motor unit firing frequencies, particularly during rapid contractions. That variability is even more noticeable during the early phases of contraction, you know, up to about the first 50 milliseconds or so. And that type of data indicates that neural activation contributes substantially to inter-individual variation as well. Okay, now, here are some of the limiting factors that we might consider. For example, insufficient activation of the motor cortex. And that goes along with number 3 down here, insufficient arousal levels. And that's one reason that if you're going to make an effort, make a maximum effort every time. Poor cortical spinal transmission, which tends to improve with training. And then one of the things we're going to talk about is not everybody has all the same motor unit types. Some people have more fast ones, some people have more slow ones, and so on. And I promise you, age has an effect. Now, here we see a study by Anderson et al. That gives us some idea of the relationship between maximum isometric strength and the rate of force development. And we see there is a very strong relationship there. So let's begin to talk about why there's some variance around that, and let's begin to talk about what takes place there. And we're going to talk about the nervous system versus muscle parameters. This is a study by Folin et al. And in this study, they very carefully tried to chart through not only electrically stimulating the muscle, but also voluntary contraction as to how much of the force output and the rate of force development was governed or related to intrinsic aspects, that is the muscle itself and fiber type, versus how much was related to the nervous system. And what we know from studies like this is that initially, in the first few milliseconds, say up to about 50 to 70 milliseconds, that is primarily the nervous system. And then after that, it becomes more and more a function of maximum strength, and then the muscle starts getting more and more involved. That is, the intrinsic properties of the muscle and the size of the muscle. So let's talk a little bit about the muscle. Now, we know that in terms of rate of force development, that the cross-sectional area, that is the total cross-sectional area of the muscle, the tissue stiffness, and particularly the fiber type are quite important. So that cross-sectional area, that is the total cross-sectional area, and as we'll see, the architecture has some influence on rate of force development. Muscle stiffness, good correlations with the rate of force development. So the stiffer the tissue is, the better it transmits force. Fiber type has very strong relationships with rate of force development. And if you've got more type 2 fibers, that is fast fibers, and if the cross-sectional area of those type 2 fibers in relation to the type 1 fiber is larger, you've got an advantage in producing not only rate of force development, but maximum force as well. So we know that fiber type has a major influence on rate of force development, and there are a number of papers showing that. The basic mechanisms are these. First of all, the isoforms of myosin heavy chains in type 2 fibers are such that the cycling rate of cross bridges is much faster. Because of that, you're going to, at any moment in time, you're going to produce more force in a type 2 fiber compared to a type 1 fiber. And therefore, the rate of force development is going to be higher. People with more type 2 fibers have an advantage there. Also, type 2 fibers handle calcium a little bit better than type 1 fibers in terms of its release rate. And the faster we can release it, the faster we can activate these things, and the higher the rate of force development. So, in terms of the fiber type and also the whole muscle as well, we know all you have to do is look around in this audience and see there's differences in total muscle. And people have differences in the amount and size of type 1 and type 2 fibers. For example, we can see that the vastus lateralis, medialis, and intermedialis have different amounts of type 1 and type 2 fibers. And that can relate to intermuscular differences. Some muscles, because of their makeup, are going to contract faster, and they will also have higher rates of force development as a result of that. Also, we know that between individuals, there are differences in those muscles. For example, in the rectus femoris, you know, the fiber types range from 25% up to about 80%, depending upon the human that you take the measurement from. And so those differences are certainly going to relate to differences not only in the magnitude of force, but also in the ability to transmit the forces and rate of force development. Now, in terms of those fiber types, remember the proportions can be different, and there are different sizes of those muscles. Adaptation to physical training. I mean, a good portion of your fiber type is genetic. But training also affects that and plays a very, a substantial role, particularly in the size of the muscles. And we know that through certain types of resistance training, which we're going to take a look at later on, you can make type 2 fibers enlarge at a faster rate than other types of resistance training. And so alterations in fiber type, that is myosin heavy chains, can occur. Alterations in the cross-sectional area can occur. And so a lot of the reasons for differences in rate of force development can not only be tracked back to genetics, but also training as well. Nevertheless, a lot of that variation is still due to other factors, like, for example, the nervous system. Now, in terms of the peak force and rate of force development and their transmission, remember there are both myofibrillar, that is myosin heavy chains primarily, and light chains. There are myofibrillar and also sarcoplasmic interactions that affect those. For example, if we can somehow through training get calcium to release at a faster rate, then the rate of force development will go up. We know, for example, that with sprint training, and this was sprint training on a bicycle, one of the effects of that training, even over a short period of time, is to get the sarcoplasmic reticulum conditioned so that it will release calcium at a faster rate, and that will also alter the rate of force development. So training can influence the rate of force development in at least a couple of different ways. Its effect on the myosin heavy chains, light chains, and so on, and upon the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, that will also affect post-activation potentiation. One of the things that we know about post-activation potentiation is that the myosin light chains, which are attached to the heavy chains, those modulate how those myosin heavy chains operate. And if we can phosphorylate those light chains at a faster rate or to a greater extent, we can now increase force production and particularly rate of force production. So one thing that can occur as a result of training is now you release calcium faster. That also may affect post-activation potentiation, because if you think about it, strength-trained people can now release that calcium faster to a greater extent, and so that may affect the post-activation potentiation to a greater extent. And there are some studies that do indeed show that. Now then, we know that muscle cross-sectional area and architecture affect both the amount of force you can produce and the rate of force development. This is from a paper by Anderson et al. And one of the things that they're showing here is that as we go from very short periods of time, and you might look at this as a critical time period, as we go from short periods of time out to longer periods of time, that the maximum strength becomes a greater factor in your ability to produce rate of force development. So one of the things then that we need to think about is if maximum strength accompanies increases in rate of force development, why is that? What's taking place here? And so some of the things that affect maximum strength are also going to affect rate of force development. And so we come back to the nervous system and what's taking place in the muscle, both in terms of cross-sectional area, change in myosin heavy chains, tissue stiffness, and so on. So one of the things that we really need to consider then is the 2-to-1 cross-sectional area ratio. That is the cross-sectional area ratio of the fast to slow fibers. We know if we can increase this, we can increase the rate of force development and also maximum force production. And so when we get into really high force productions, now as you add muscle, we have greater angles of pennation, and as we'll see, those greater angles of pennation not only affect the maximum force that you can produce, but also through a gearing effect, which we're about to talk about, and that is actual rotation of the fibers around the tendon. We can actually affect not only the rate of force development, but the velocity of movement as well. And so, again, in rate of force development or in the magnitude of force that's being produced, we not only have to think about the size of the muscle, the type of muscle, fast versus slow, but also muscle architecture changes where we change the angle of pennation. And because of what takes place at different levels of contraction, there can be rotations in the fibers themselves that will, in a sense, play off velocity versus rate of force development. And I think that we can see this through a schematic here. Here we have a relaxed muscle, and you see the angle of pennation. And if we looked at a top view, this gives you some idea of basically the cross-section there. If we are using a low force, high velocity movement, notice here that if we look at the top view, that the cross-sectional area of the muscle actually enlarges. And during that, notice here that we actually have a rotation. Notice that angle is different than that angle. Because of that, as we'll see, the tendon and the fiber itself move at different velocities, and we'll see that because of that, we favor velocity during this over rate of force development. But as the load becomes heavier and we move more towards our maximum ability to produce force, notice here that the shape of that fiber becomes more like it was at rest. And now the angle is very little changed, or almost the same as it was at rest. Now it's the other way around. We don't have a gearing effect. We don't have rotation of the fiber. And so we can produce very high rates of force development as well as high magnitudes of force. So what we have here, a high gear ratio, a low gear ratio. And so, for example, in low force, basically low load contractions, the whole muscle is going to be moving at a higher velocity than the muscle fiber because of that gearing effect. That doesn't happen over here in the higher forces. And so, again, partly because of this gearing effect, we can develop higher velocities with lower loads. Okay? We don't do that with the higher loads. And it's partly because of that gearing effect. The pennation angle has a lot to do with that. And the pennation angle actually changes as the muscle changes its cross-sectional area. Okay, so again, there's some important factors here in terms of muscle. How much muscle you have, the stiffness of the tissue, which we'll get to in a second, the type of fiber you have, and clearly the magnitude of force production and the rate of force production favor a high 2-to-1 cross-sectional area ratio. And then there's the gearing on top of that. And what we find here is the recruitment patterns of slow and fast twitch muscle, the angle of pennation, and so on, all play together to allow you to make faster or slower movements, higher or not so high rates of force development. Now, there's one other factor here, and that is the length of the fibers of the length of the fascicle. And what we know from several different studies, for example, these here, is that longer fascicles or longer muscles are potentially going to produce lower rates of force development, especially in the early parts of the force time curve. And that's because you've got a longer series elastic substance, you've got more sarcomeres in series and so on. There is more slack in that system. And so before you can start producing rates of force development at a higher level, you've got to get the slack out. Okay, so shorter muscle fibers are going to produce higher rates of force development. Now, we can talk a little bit about the third important factor, or most important factor of the three. This is not the most important, but one of the most important, tissue stiffness. Okay. Now, stiffness basically can be defined by this formula, and that is stiffness is the force divided by the displacement along the same path that the force is moving. So the transmission through a material is going to be influenced by stiffness. And this was a formula that was developed by Wilkie way back in 1949. Why A.V. Hill and Wilkie and these folks don't use more obvious letters? I mean, for example, if you look at A.V. Hill's old equations, P stood for force. And in this particular case, V actually stands for force transmission. So what we find here is that force transmission, stiffness plays a major role there. And it's also a function of the length and divided by the resting length, and the mass divided by the length of the material. So, in terms of force transmission, which again is extremely important in rate of force development, then we can begin to understand why different muscles have different rates of force development based on stiffness and the muscle itself. One of the things that we talked about before was that, for example, plantar flexors. They are relatively long muscles. There's a long tendon there. They have, in relative terms, a low rate of force development because there is a lot of slack in that particular tissue complex. On the other hand, the quadriceps, the muscles in the quadriceps, tend to have shorter fibers, shorter fascicles. Because of that, there is less slack. They're going to produce higher rates of force development. And that deals partially with tissue stiffness and the ability of that tissue to transmit forces. And so we've got positive correlations between tissue stiffness and rate of force development. In fact, pretty strong correlations. Again, the more or the greater your maximum strength, the greater your ability to produce force, there's a number of reasons there why that gives you some advantages in rate of force development. One of them comes back to increased tissue stiffness, because we know with strength training we can alter the tissue stiffness in a positive direction. Okay. Now, even though we've just gone through some evidence that the cross-sectional area, particularly the fiber type specific cross-sectional area and architectural differences, influence rate of force development, obviously there's a lot more experimental evidence that's necessary. And this might be a good thesis of dissertation for some of them. So now let's get to training effects, okay? So let's go through some cross-sectional studies. Here is a study that recently came out by Methanides et al. And basically what he found, as we have laid the background for, is that stronger, more powerful athletes tend not only to produce higher forces, both isometrically and dynamically, but they produce higher rates of force development. And here we see the power athletes were a little bit better than the strength athletes, that were a lot better than the endurance athletes, that were about the same as the untrained athletes. Now, there are several cross-sectional studies that show that. But what about longitudinal studies? Well, in terms of longitudinal studies, what we want to happen is a shift in the activation of the muscle, which will correspond to a shift in the force time curve. There are many studies going back into the 1980s that show that this is true. Comey, for example, did studies back in the early and, in fact, back into the 1970s, showing very clearly that with strength training, your ability to activate muscle is improved, okay? And that with detraining, it detrains. Here's a more recent study by Zaris et al. And again, notice that these different time periods, we find increases in the amount of force and therefore the rate of force development that can be generated. And you can see that here in a table. Here are the rates of force development, and we see pre-post a short period of time, just a few weeks, we see improvements in rate of force development, and also the impulse, which is greatly influenced by the rate of force development. Now, as we started out, the type of training can influence not only the magnitude of force production, but also particularly influence the rate of force development and the velocity of movement and power output. Now, one of the things we know, this is a controversial area right now, but there is mounting evidence that training to failure on a regular basis is probably not the best way you can train. We also know from several studies here that a combination of training, particularly if you do them in the right order, of heavy and light days or heavy and light sets within the same session and so on, can markedly enhance perhaps the magnitude of force, but certainly your explosiveness, rate of force development, velocity of movement, and power output. And this is pretty well known now. But getting back to the overall presentation here, we know that force transmission, magnitude of force production, rate of force development can be strongly influenced by the cross-sectional area, particularly the 2-to-1 ratio. It can be influenced by nervous system alterations and certainly tissue stiffness, and there are many studies showing these. So we would argue then that enhanced force transmission and high rates of force development are primary requisites if you want to be particularly a good strength power athlete. The primary mechanisms, again, are neural, changes in cross-sectional area and architecture, and tissue stiffness. All of those are influenced by genetics, but all of them can be influenced by appropriate training. We also know that force transmission and rate of force development, absolutely. And we talked about appropriate training. Not all training is alike. Not all strength training is alike. And resistance training to failure appears to be less efficacious. So, in that case then, I think I just ran out of time.